Hey everybody. So today I'm going to go over some stuff that will be really helpful with that 1.04 assignment that people struggled with a little bit because it really didn't have the information that they needed there. So we're going to start with this. For those of you that came to the optional Zoom content setting last Monday, there will be a little bit of kind of repeating here because a lot of that stuff is kind of the stuff you needed for that 1.04. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about pre-Columbian civilizations and European settlement. All right. So the first question is, how do people get into North America? That has changed over the years in what we believe. For a long time, this theory that the water between Alaska and Siberia froze over and people walked across that frozen water down into North America was kind of the given theory. It's what everybody believed. Over the last maybe 10 to 15 years, there's been more and more evidence that perhaps human beings developed in North America at approximately the same time they were developing over in Africa, maybe a little bit later than that. All right. However, they developed independently. If you look at a lot of the Native American creation stories, they talk about Native Americans being independently created by the creator in North America. All right. And for a long time, that was thought to just be religious myth. But more and more evidence, including DNA evidence, is showing that that might be more of a possibility. So now we talk about this Bering Sea land bridge as a theory. It's no longer considered to be a historical fact. So native culture and lifestyle before colonization, all right, you had multiple different kinds of tribes, all right, with multiple different ways of life. Some were nomadic, some stayed in the same place. Gender roles were similar, though not the same, between all the tribes. Women shared in the labor. All right. The religions were all a little bit different, but most of them were animistic religions, where nature and animals were held in very high regard in religious regard. And one of the most important things when we talk about a lot of the Native American civilizations is their farming techniques and Three Sisters farming, which is a way to grow squash and beans and what we call today corn all in the same spot, because they all use different nutrients out of the soil, was very, very effective. As a matter of fact, it's one of the things that the Europeans took back to Europe, which is going to cause a huge population boom. Because as a general rule, if we have food, we have more people. That's kind of a historical fact. All right. So along the right side here, you can see some of the different places and tribes that inhabited different parts of what's going to be called the New World. All right. Lots of different people, lots of different tribes doing lots of different things, all the way from North America down into Central and South America, where we had very, very populated, larger cities among the Incas, the Aztecs, and the Mayans. So that's all important information to know. Okay, it's important to know what was going on in Europe before this as well. So the Renaissance brought us great technological innovations. A lot of those innovations came kind of post-Crusades from the Muslims of the Middle East, who were a little bit more technologically advanced than Europe. We saw the growth of nation states. We're going to see what we would today call countries grow and form. All right, and we're going to see significant religious warfare. All right, we get the Protestant Revolution, started by Luther and the development of Lutheranism. That's going to expand to all different kinds of religions. We're going to have a counter Reformation by the Catholic Church, and all of that's going to lead to violence and warfare throughout Europe. All right, and a lot of that warfare will spill over into the New World. For example, what we tend to know as the French and Indian War is a very small part of a much greater conflict in Europe known as the 7 Years' War. The Dutch controlled international commerce at this time. Now, that's not going to last a long time, but at this time, they were really strongly in control of a lot of the international commerce. The first people that were involved in the settlement of the New World were the Portuguese and the Spanish. To avoid any fights over that New World, they went to the Pope. Both of those are heavily Catholic countries, and asked them to draw a line. You can see this first line here. The lighter line is where Pope Alexander VI drew the line. He basically said, okay, the Spanish can have everything to the left, and the Portuguese can have everything to the right. You can see Portugal doesn't get a real great benefit here, keeping in mind that obviously they didn't know all this land existed over here. When they actually created the treaty, which is the Treaty of Tordesillas, they moved that line a little bit. All right, but you can still see that Spain gets the much greater end of the deal. All right, that is going to have significant effect all the way till today. For example, if we look at Brazil, all right, a much bigger country today, but Brazil's native language is Portuguese. All right, because that was settled by Portugal, whereas the rest of Central and South America were settled by the Spanish. All right, so instead we get Spanish as the official language of many of those countries. So we've all heard of the reasons Europeans came to the New World: God, glory. I always say gold and gold. It should probably be the 4Gs instead of the 3Gs, because it was really about money. Yes, there was conversion, and that was part of it. Yes, sailors sailed for glory of finding new lands, but really gold and money was the impetus for them to sail. All right, so we get Christopher Columbus obviously sailing for Spain, even though he was Italian. We get Jacques Cartier, who was the first person to come to the New World from France. The Dutch, we get Henry Hudson. We still have Hudson Bay up in the north. And the English are going to send a number of different people. We'll get into the English later and their different types of colonies. Talk about the Columbian Exchange. This is a really important chart. Quite often in short answer questions and essays, you're going to get questions about the Columbian Exchange. What came from Europe over to the Americas? What came from the Americas over to Europe? Both positive and negative. All right, so this is a chart you should take some time looking at and taking some notes on, and make sure that you know 3 or 4 different things that went in both directions. All right, that's a real important thing that shows up a lot in the AP test. Okay, so let's talk about the 4 major groups that are going to colonize the New World. All right, we're going to get the French, we're going to get the English, we're going to get the Spanish, and we're going to get the Dutch a little bit. They're not going to last very long. We'll talk briefly about them. When we talk about the 3 major ones, the French, the Spanish, and the English, I always say, have you ever heard the term lead, follow, or get out of the way? That's a pretty common saying. And you can use that to help you remember kind of what it was like in those new colonies. Okay, for each of those 3 major countries. So the French in America wanted the Native Americans to lead them. They wanted them to lead them to furs. It was really a lot about trading, setting up alliances, so that they could get the furs and bring them back to Europe, where they could sell them for a lot of money. They did have Jesuit priests go with them often, and they did convert natives to Catholicism, but they tended to do it through persuasion and not through violence and force. Okay, that's going to be really a direct opposite to what the Spanish did, where force was a very common method of conversion. All right, you're going to see the fur trade become very, very important. All right, the native relations with the French are the best of all the 4 major colonizers. Doesn't mean they were perfect. All right, but they set up trade networks. They created alliances. They weren't really coming over to try to take over the Native Americans, and that's really different than the other 2 major ones, especially, but really the other 3 major countries. Intermarriage was much more common in the French contacts with the Native Americans than either with the English, the Spanish, or the Dutch. All right, and their relationships were pretty solid. Okay, so they again wanted the Native Americans to lead them to the furs. The Spanish wanted the Native Americans to follow them. Okay, you're going to get the creations of royal colonies called viceroys. And the relations with the natives tended to be much more conquistador, right? You have the Spanish conquistadors taking over the Native Americans, enslaving the Native Americans, and forcing them to convert to Catholicism. All right, you're going to get a system of missions that are set up all through the Southwest. A lot of those missions still exist today. Those buildings are still there. You can go tour them. If you go to, like, for example, San Antonio, many spots in California. All right, and we see much more forced conversion than we saw with the French. Okay, that is going to lead to revolt. It's really important, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later today as well in my content zoom at 2:30. All right, but it's really important to realize that both the Native Americans as well as African Americans didn't just accept being enslaved. There was fighting, violence, and revolt. Okay, one of the first great revolts among the Native Americans was the Pueblo Revolt, often called Pope's Rebellion, in 1680, and it was pretty successful. It was in New Mexico. It basically kicked the Spanish out of New Mexico for about 60 years before they were able to return. All right, so there were revolutions and successful revolutions and pushback against Spanish rule. All right. The creation of the encomienda system is really important. Okay, the encomienda system was a system in which the Spanish government granted land to conquistadors and other people from Spain, and it was naturally assumed then that that land also came with the people on that land. All right, so if the Spanish crown granted a conquistador land, all right, any natives that were on that land were then their slaves, basically, even though they didn't use that word. All right. They use those slaves to find gold. They use those slaves in the mines. That's going to continue for hundreds of years. And we also see the first large agricultural plantations really by the Spanish. We think of that more with the English, especially when we get into African American slavery. All right. But we're going to see that with the Spanish earlier using Native American slaves. Okay. That's going to lead to the Spanish caste system because you are not going to get a lot of intermarriage. All right, but you are unfortunately going to get a lot of rape and sex in that manner. All right, and therefore you're going to get mixed race between the Spanish, all right, as well as the Native Americans. And that's going to create this kind of a colonial class structure in the New World where people who are born in Spain are on the top, people who were born of Spanish parents but in the New World are next, all right. Kind of mixed race between the Spanish and Native Americans were next. Then you had the Native Americans, and at the bottom, enslaved persons. And those could be either from Africa or the Caribbean, or also Native American slaves. Okay, so the Spanish are going to want the Native Americans to follow them. They're going to want them to follow their orders. They're going to want to follow their religion, and they're going to do that through force quite often. The English, for the most part, just wanted the natives to get out of the way. All right. They often start with very small colonies. You can see the purpose of those colonies. They're not meant to be super permanent because often they're all men. Now, with Roanoke and Jamestown, we're going to start to see that change. All right. But to begin with, those were often all men. You're going to see a lot of population growth. Very quickly once these colonies actually get a foothold. It takes a little bit. We're going to see a couple failed colonies first. Newfoundland as well as Roanoke are failed colonies. But once the colonies get settled, all right, you're going to see population grow very fast. Really for two reasons. One is indentured servants, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. And also you're going to see a push from England to push undesirables over to the New World. Sometimes those were criminals. Quite often they were people in poverty, people that were evicted from their homes and their land, quite often from Ireland, which was controlled by the British. And you're going to get those people sent to the New World. So you're going to get relatively quick, fast population growth. All right, with the relations with the native, you get a little bit of early native assistance, but very quickly that turns to animosity and exclusion. The English are going to want the Native Americans to just get out of their way, to move out of their land, and that's really going to become American policy. You can argue all the way up till the 1930s, where the Americans are just going to continue. Well, at this point, the English colonists and then the Americans are going to just want to continue moving the Native Americans out of their way so that they can expand. And then even after they've expanded throughout the entire of the New World, they're going to want Native Americans to not be Native American. Okay, the destruction of the Native American culture is going to be official American government policy all the way up until the early 1900s, and we'll talk about that as we go through time. Very quickly, you're going to see some significant wars between the Native Americans and English colonies, kind of culminating with King Philip's War. All right, in 1675, which was going to be a really significant conflict. All right, and that kind of conflict is going to continue. We know smallpox is going to be a significant portion of that. All right. And that is kind of the discussion. Now, we didn't get into the Dutch and the English very much. I'm going to get into the English as well as the Dutch, a lot more starting today. That's really kind of the content that's going to go forward here over the next week. All right. So if you're interested in learning more about that, come to my Zoom at 2:30. I'll do a live lecture. You could ask questions. All right. And we'll talk really about the English and the Dutch settlements and how the English colonies really started to lay out as they got together. If you have any questions, email me. I hope to see you at 2:30. Otherwise, have a good week.